Welcome to Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance by voices within the independent Catholic movement. For more information on inclusive Catholicism, please visit extraordinarycatholics.faith. And now, meet your hosts, Reverend Dr. Trish Sullivan-Bonney and Reverend Dr. Jayme Matthias.
Welcome to Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance. I'm Father Jayme Matthias.
And I am Reverend Trish Sullivan-Bonney.
And for this episode, we have a very special guest, Reverend Trish.
Well, I am so delighted to have face-to-face time, albeit electronically, with Jamie Manson. So some of you might recognize Jamie's name. She was a reporter with the National Catholic Reporter for 12 years and wrote a column. And one of the things that I really valued about Jamie's time, and is part of why I wanted to talk to her with the other Jamie. So if it gets really confusing right now because we're talking to Jamie, well, I know you gentle listeners will be kind to us. Jamie was in the mix at the National Catholic Reporter during a period where it was extremely forthright in facing the social issues that were a conundrum for the Roman Catholic Church, for writing in a very honest way about the challenges that were being faced by the Roman Catholic Church. I was at that point in my life in the Roman Catholic Church and an activist, and always appreciated the role that NCR was playing to make sure that the Catholic community in the United States was well and accurately informed. I also want to do a shout out to the NCR because I think they have returned to that level of mission in the last couple of years in a really profound way, which is very exciting to me. Jamie left the NCR and went on to be the executive director of Catholics for Choice. Is it for Free Choice? No, Catholics for Choice.
It used to be Free Choice, yeah.
Right, I know. It's like, oh, wait, am I getting it wrong? And that too, Jamie, just felt to me like a very bold step to be willing to speak on behalf of so many faithful and thoughtful Catholics who, around the question of abortion, were exercising their conscience. So Jamie's had a fabulous career. She was named Religious Leader to Watch Out For by the Center for American Progress and is currently a Henry Luce Fellow at the University of Colorado Boulder's Center for Media, Religion, and Culture. So Jayme, anything you would want to add to that wonderful bio that we've just gone through?
No, I think you've captured the high notes for sure.
And one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you, and I know Jamie felt the same way, is that we are part of a movement that could be characterized as a large body of people exercising faithful dissent, saying that we love the tradition, we deeply love the tradition, and we are committed to its renewal. So Jamie, I'm going to turn to you, Jayme Matthias, and give you the first question. Here we are with this person who's been quite a samurai in both as an observer, a reporter, and a leader in the Roman Catholic community. What questions are bubbling for you tonight?
I am so excited to have Jayme with us this evening, partly because today, as we record this, we are marking the 53rd anniversary of Roe versus Wade. We know that our friends in the Roman Catholic world are honoring this in one way with the March for Life in Washington, D.C. We know that there are others who are helping to give voice to how it is that there are other perspectives on this issue, especially because abortion, or what I prefer to call women's reproductive rights, has been the issue has been so used by the religious right to pit people against others and also to get people to vote in certain ways. So Jayme, so glad to have you with us. Happy to see where the Spirit leads your heart as today we mark the 53rd anniversary of Roe versus Wade.
Yeah, what to say about it? I mean, it's, of course, Roe fell a few years ago while I was still president of Catholics for Choice. Not much has changed on that piece, but what I have really dedicated my time to now is working with interdisciplinary and transnational group of theologians on trying to create a theology that accommodates abortion and reproductive freedom And the reason is because so many Catholic women have abortions.
Mhm.
1 in 4 in this country, in the United States, has an abortion. And we have a church teaching that is so radical, so absolutist, absolute condemnation in any and all circumstances. And that is such a rejection of the human experience, and the experience of Catholic families, not just Catholic women, Catholic families, and it's to me, it is one of the gravest spiritual violences of Catholic teaching because you have women, you have families that have chosen abortion for any and so many different circumstances why they had to choose it, or they wanted to choose it, so many circumstances, and they have to go to mass every week and hear that they are complicit in homicide.
Mhm.
And it's just, to me, and women have to sit there in silence and they can't speak, and there's no opportunity for conversation about it. I had the privilege, I came out in my first column in the National Catholic Reporter in 2008. It was a very different time for queer Catholics. It was, 5 years before Who Am I to Judge and Pope Francis, Pope Benedict was Pope. It was a very homophobic, much more homophobic. And it's been a pleasure for me, so many years on now, nearly 20 years on since I came out, to see that issue move and conversation being had, and a lot, Pope Francis allowing for blessing of same-sex couples. I never could have imagined that was
Mhm.
going to happen in my lifetime. But abortion is, wow, that is still the third rail issue. And why, the reason I really struggle with it is that it affects more Catholics than LGBTQ issues does. It affects a lot more Catholics. And there's just absolute silence about it, and shame and stigma. And that has to be addressed. So that's why I'm working on a report with an interdisciplinary group of theologians, sociologists, philosophers, to really do what the church refuses to do, which is start to do some very serious theological thinking about this, even if the church isn't ready.
It seems to me, Jayme, that there's a neuralgic set of issues around women in the Roman Catholic system. There's the neuralgic issue of um, ordination and full sacramental participation. There's the neuralgic issue around autonomy of our bodies. There's the neuralgic issue around needing to say that a sacramental marriage has come to an end without a lot of pain, suffering, and expense, and some usually white male celibate person weighing in. There's neuralgic issues around leadership because it's so hard for women to access certain areas of leadership in the church, um, due to the fact that they're excluded in so many ways. I'm wondering, and certainly our lesbian sisters, and on some level, our condemnation of the gay community as a whole around sexuality, which is very tied in. My mother grew up in that very conservative church, and she was extremely resentful about the church till the day she died because she thought they all went into terrible marriages just to have sex at age 18, right? So much wounding, so much wounding. I'm wondering what your experience has been like talking to the institution leaders or trying to write for them around. You've addressed many of these issues in your column and then in your later work. Like, what's your experience like? I mean, I have a certain biased idea about what it must be like to talk to clerics and bishops, but tell us a little bit about your experience as a voice with these issues.
Trish, I wish I could. None of them will talk to me,
Oh
unfortunately.
no!
I wish I
Okay,
could say
on to
we've
the
had
next question.
robust, quiet conversations, but they don't. And I think that says a lot, doesn't it? I mean, they're much, they won't even talk to me on the LGBTQ issue. I think they're much more inclined to talk to someone like Jim Martin, or a male, to be quite frank with you, than they would be to talk to me. And as I said, I deal with that third real issue of abortion. And unfortunately, what had happened is that I, wasn't as welcome to talk about LGBTQ issues. As that issue progressed in a positive way within the institution, I got pushed out I got uninvited from conferences, that I would have been at, and so it made me persona non grata in LGBTQ Catholic spaces, and that's been very sad for me as someone that I think was, on the a pioneer in that. I if I were still at NCR, I would still be the only out lesbian in the Catholic media in the world. I would still reign with that title. And so yeah, so that has been hard. But the work has to go on no matter what. And I know that it has influence, and I like to think that coming out so early helped move the conversation that's happening without me right now. But that's okay. That's why I do the work. I do work that on issues that I will not see resolved in my lifetime, by and large. And I'm okay with that. I'm at peace with that.
Jayme, I have to imagine that it's even deeper than being pushed out, though, if you don't mind my massaging that a bit. I've got to imagine that as president of Catholics for Choice, that you have taken your share of arrows. I'm just imagining you putting up your shield and taking the arrows that have come in your direction. Anything that you might share with us in that respect, especially for our listeners who've taken some arrows themselves in life and or in their ministries, especially for those who find themselves on the periphery of the Roman Catholic Church. Because I'll be honest with you, here in Austin, Texas, as Austin's only inclusive Catholic community, the arrows that we take are typically from our friends within the Roman Catholic Church. And so I just have that question for you of how it is that, if you have any wisdom from your own experience on how it is that we might, with grace, respond to those who are throwing arrows in our direction. The day before yesterday, we celebrated Saint Sebastian as a church. And it's just, I'm poignantly aware of how it was that he took a good number of arrows, and even those arrows didn't kill him. They had to come and club him to death. And some of us are feeling a bit clobbered and or pierced by the issues that are happening. Especially, I'm thinking of Trish and our friends in Minnesota who are taking a lot of arrows to defend God's people there. Any wisdom or insights from your own experience?
That really resonates with me because I used to work in a Catholic parish from 2006 to 2008, right before I started writing my column. And it was one of those parishes where you could be out. It was a Jesuit parish in Manhattan, and the pastor was a Jesuit, was out. I was out, other staff were out. And so it was a very welcoming place, but it still was, I really felt what I call the clericalism of the laity. And that, it was where I really saw that I was not valid in my own church. It was a very painful realization, but ultimately, I say, it was deformational and formational, because I'll tell you one quick story of what happened one day. It was July or August, and all the Jesuits were away. And I was there in the parish, and a man came very distressed. We had this open door ministry, or anyone could come at any time to our door, and we would encounter them. We would greet them. And he was very distressed. So the person at the front desk called me, "Will you talk to him?" I said, "Yeah, absolutely." And I came in, and he looked at me and he said, "I don't want to talk to you." I hadn't even said a word. I was halfway through the door, and I said, my God, what does he know? What did I do? I'm trying to think, like, how does he know me? And he said, "I want to make a confession." And I said, "Oh, okay." So just seeing my body, my female form, I was immediately invalidated, and so it's a very powerful thing. It's that's just one example of just how powerful the institution is, the institutional church, and people's fear of leaving it is very, very strong. And not upsetting daddy is how I kind of put it. You don't want to upset, this great meta father that the church is. And I think that there's an extent to which, and I learned this early on in the reform movement, there's always some Catholics who are progressive But they always think they're going to be the one that gets through to the church. They're going to be the change agent because they're playing it different than than those other naughty people that did a schism or did, or broke away or got ordained, women that got ordained, because we're going to do it right. And that's always been a real pain point, in the movement. So what I like to say is, there's no right way or wrong way to do this work of reform. Our Catholicism is, the most beautiful thing about our Catholicism isn't, to me, the social justice tradition, which is amazing, don't get me wrong, is our sacramental tradition. This notion that God is everywhere, that church, there is no wall around church. It's everywhere. And if you really have a sacramental view of the world, there is no inside or outside of the church. And that's something I've been trying to get people to see in the reform movement for a long time, so that we don't have these arrows being slung at those of us who are trying to do reform and transform the church in a different way. There's no wrong way or right way to do it. There's no in and there's no out. And so I've always thought that was a false binary. And so for me, that's what I hold on to. The sacramental view of the world has kept me calling myself Catholic, even in my darkest, loneliest moments. So I think that's it, to really embrace that tradition, embrace that broken God, embrace the God who has been rejected, who has been ostracized. That's the God who has kept me company, the God on the margins. That's where I think God lives. And so that is what has what has given me strength and purpose and meaning throughout all this work, and its loneliness and its arrows.
Right. And that really resonates, I think, for Jayme and me, because any of us who had to go through discernment to leave our family, I like to call it our family of origin, who had to leave our family of origin, that's very, very painful. It's just in the way that, psychologically it can be painful to set aside, a dysfunctional family and say, I'm going to have a healthy life and I'm going to do things differently. I have a really dear friend here in Minnesota who's been a wonderful mentor. And I was sort of naive. I thought, well, if we create this inclusive, independent, sacramentally focused, justice-oriented church, all these alienated people I know who just quit, who just voted with their feet, they'll all flock to us. We'll have 150 families in no time. Well, my friend, it didn't happen that way. And that was before COVID. I'm not going to blame COVID. And I remember my friend Patricia, who was a national leader around preaching, said to me, oh, Trish, Catholic is a blood type. When you ask people to no longer be Roman Catholic, you're asking them to change their blood type. And I have really spent time thinking about that, because I do think there's a kind of institutional grip on people. There's an institutional grip, for example, around who are the holy people, right? So when that guy saw you, by virtue of your being, you weren't it, right? And I had the other side of the coin experience, which is when I was a chaplain. After I did my MDiv at St. John's, which is a large Benedictine school here in Minnesota, and I was out doing CPE, and of course, walking into hospital rooms. And Minnesota has a huge Lutheran population. So as I walked in, my little baby chaplain self, I cannot tell you the number of times I heard people say to the person in the bed, oh, sweetheart, oh, honey, oh, whatever, Mary, don't worry, pastor's here now.
Yeah.
Pastor's here.
Wow.
And that actually was a big piece of my realizing that I needed to look hard at this whole thing about self-expression, identity, and serving. What was I called to do? Once people were saying, oh, pastor's here, it was really, really changed me. And it's not to say that it's easy. I kind of wonder, so I stayed inside for a long time thinking the fight has to come from the inside. And then I eventually, a number of other people said, my place is to build this new thing outside. What has sustained you? You've been this voice of, calling for justice and change, and doing it very thoughtfully, very theologically. What have you been doing to stay in the game for the long haul?
Because I think I'm right. I know I'm right. I know that sounds wild, but maybe I'm an Aries. I don't know. But I really do believe these things. And I really believe in the sacramentality. I really believe I'm Catholic. I really do think the church can do better and has to do better because it's so powerful. So that, I always say I have my good days and bad days, and on the good days, I stay in it and I'm, sustained by the fact that I believe in these things, that the Catholic tradition has given profound meaning to my life, especially witnessing suffering and going through my own suffering. And so that's, I believe these things. And I've seen Catholics do extraordinary, intrepid things. And I know it's because of the faith we have and it is a unique faith, tradition. On my bad days, it's because the church is so incredibly powerful. The Catholic Church is the largest non-governmental provider of healthcare and education in the world. So its tendrils stretch out, and it has profound power in legislatures around the world. They have profound political influence, including in the United States. So, I have to stay in and fight because it's this Leviathan. There's an aspect of it that's a Leviathan, and that is hurting and harming vulnerable bodies, both Catholic and non-Catholic, through these teachings and through its charities and its institutions and its clinics and its hospitals and its schools. And so the work has to be done. I feel very compelled by that because the laborers are few, as you know. So that's really it, is one foot in and one foot out is sort of how I see myself. The proverbial liminal space that I live in. So that's really it. That's what sustains me is I also, I just I can't do. I've tried, that Godfather. Every time I think I'm out, they pull me back in. Believe me, I've tried to get out of this.
Yeah.
But God wants me to be here. God always, even though when I'm really done and I'm really tired, God shows me that God still wants me to do this. And I'm like, okay, we'll keep doing it. So that's really what it is. Because it can be very lonely work for sure.
Jamie, I'm just getting back from spending 5 nights in Rome earlier this month. And I think, when a person is in a city like that, just seeing all the excess that was built by this church being able to bring together so many people and resources to be able to build all these grand monuments, it just really, I am struck by how big the institution is. But I think the feeling that I have right now is that in many ways, I feel like a salmon trying to swim upstream, and two of the great currents that are pushing against me as I'm swimming upstream are patriarchy and power imbalances. I say that as a man in the United States. I'm just, here we are in Austin's only inclusive Catholic community. Yesterday, as a church, we celebrated Saint Agnes. And I'm just struck as I reflect on her life, how it is that at 12 years old, in the sixth grade, she was given away to marriage, not to another sixth grader, but obviously to a man very much older than her, which just sets up this immediate power imbalance for poor little Agnes. But poor little Agnes, unfortunately, is a metaphor for so much that continues to happen in our church and in our world today as a result of patriarchy and power imbalances. So I'm just wondering if you have any insights, especially because what I fear is that the gains of these last decades, and we've come a long way, but we still have not seen the promised land. In 250 years as a nation, we still have not seen a woman president. But at the same time, we've made certain advances. And at least with the immigrant community with which I work, where we once prized the gospel values of diversity and equity and inclusion, to see all those being now rolled back, just really, it's a sobering moment for me to think about how it is that so many rights and so much of what we took for granted before is being rolled back. And I think that today, being the 53rd anniversary of Roe versus Wade, is probably the best example of that. How it is that our daughters and granddaughters today enjoy less freedom, less rights than their mothers and their grandmothers. And that it disturbs me that these currents, patriarchy, power imbalances, and others are just fighting those of us who are trying to push forward and to bring us one step closer to the gospel.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the hardest thing about it is to see how many Catholics are complicit in this loss of rights. And that was a lot of my work at Catholics for Choice was constantly bringing that up. 7 of 9 Supreme Court justices are Catholic. I mean, Neil Gorsuch was raised Catholic. He now identifies as Episcopal, so it's really 6. But every justice of Supreme Court that struck down Roe was, well, either Catholic or was raised Catholic. That's Gorsuch. So it was a Catholic thing. The architects of Project 2025 were Catholic. The theology that they're resting so much of this on, this notion of anti-gender ideology and is Catholic. I mean, Protestant, I'm sorry, evangelicals are politically powerful, but they don't have a theological tradition. They have taken these ideas from these notions of personhood and life beginning at conception. These are not Protestant ideas. The anti-gender ideology movements that are really, really powerful globally. These are not, Protestant ideas. These are all Catholic ideas that are unfortunately eroding rights. And, that's why it's so important for Catholics to speak up. For me, it drives me wild that the majority of Catholics in this country support trans rights, support same-sex marriage, support women's equality, and support abortion rights. The vast majority support access to abortion in all or most cases. And yet we get drowned out. We have already done or doing a new theology around these issues. So that I think is the hardest thing. And that's why I think it's so important to push for theological and doctrinal change. And not only push for the change, but what you're doing in your communities, living it out, living it out, incarnating it now, showing people what it can look like. That not only are these ideas, we're doing it, and Catholics are happy. The sacrament, God is everywhere, and God can work through women's bodies, and God can work through gay bodies, and God works through trans bodies. God is not limited by these very, very rigid theological ideas that in no way resonate with human experience, and they're supposed to. So that to me that's always to me the call, is that remembering that how much unfortunately Catholics are responsible for so much of the rollback we're seeing.
Yeah, listening to you talk about Catholic opinion, how do you reconcile that with the fact that like the majority of Roman Catholic women voted for Donald Trump? I mean,
Yeah.
and I wonder if part of it is the institutional power and the patriarchy that, the message that gets put out is, oh gosh, this is such a bad word, but it feels like slightly manipulative.
Mm-hmm.
That you're not a good cat. Like people do not understand the teachings on conscience,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't understand the theology of all of this the way you do, or even there are a lot of really well-informed lay people. I don't want to, totally diss everybody, but so that when, someone's up at the front in the podium in the election season pushing the bishop's brochure, that they look at that like so here's a good example. I have a neighbor, and very strong progressive, and I was canvassing for Obama. This is before I was a priest. And she really liked everything he stood for, but she couldn't vote for him because he was pro-choice.
Yeah.
And I actually had to dig out for her the data on how abortion drops in Democratic presidencies, because the social safety net is so much better for women, right, that they have more agency around that choice. And it was only when I sat with her and I like walked her through this that she could be even to just let in a glimmer of the possibility that she could pull the lever, or in our case, check the box in Minnesota for a Democrat, so that's like a kind of cognitive dissonance to me. Like, what do you make of that? That like on the one level, Americans are Americans. The 1 in 4 number, just from talking to my women friends, I know that's an accurate number, right? And yet the way in which people, and it really is people of a certain generation, right, are still held so tight, so captive to there's a right and wrong choice for Catholics around these decisions.
Yeah. There's a lot of factors that went into his election, obviously profound racism, profound anti-immigrant sentiment, women being unduly influenced by men in their voting. There's a lot of data around that. But I will, but so I what I will speak to from my part, my area of expertise is the women's issue. And I do believe, going back again to this story when I was in the parish and I didn't have the magic to give this man absolution. This is what I learned working in the parish is how deep this runs in women as well as men. This notion that women do not have authority and power and validity. It's something very frightening for Catholics about women being in full power. And that's why it's so heartening to hear, Trish, that people are referring to you as pastor and all of that. But the famous story about Mary Rammerman, the first time she lifted the chalice at what was then Corpus Christi, people had a nervous breakdown. Even when I was at this parish, St. Francis Xavier in Manhattan back in the 2006, 2007, I would wear an alb when we would do baptisms because I would prep the families for baptism. And God bless the pastor at the time, may he rest in peace. He would let me wear an alb when we would do the rites of baptism. And there was never a time that I put on that alb that I didn't get constant commentary from the parishioners. Everything from "don't you look cute," or "oh, you think you're a priest now," or "oh, look," I mean, it was just like, "Oh, you look lovely in white," it was relentless. And it's just there's such a discomfort with women's power. I just wrote a piece about 2 months ago, a very spicy piece that was in Religion Dispatches, where I made an argument that if only, let's say all men were straight and only women were homosexuals, shall we say, let's say homosexuality only afflicted women and not men. Would we be at the point that we are in the Catholic Church? Because there was this big march, rainbow march during the end of the Jubilee year. And these LGBTQ Catholics were welcomed in a way that was unheard of and unexpected. And yet, when women go to the Vatican, and make women's ordination activists and advocates go to the Vatican and make their presence known, they are arrested, they are detained, they are hunted down. It was such a difference. And so, even within our own LGBTQ community, I think that issue has gotten far because it affects men. I really do. And it's something that I keep calling the LGBTQ Catholics to take a look at is, how has this movement progressed because it affects men, because it affects men's rights, because it affects men's dignity in the church? And if it only affected women, would we be anywhere? Would we have blessings, for same-sex couples? I mean, it's a question I really have for this movement is because I think it even affects progressive movements, this fear of women and this fear of women's power.
Jamie, in my experience, our society and our church is a bit bipolar. We have various personalities and or perspectives on this issue, which just absolutely fascinate me. Here at Holy Family, Austin's only inclusive Catholic community, when people say women can't be priests, we can point to Mother Annie and to Deacon Elsa and how it is that they enflesh the gospel values of Jesus, and they minister in many ways more effectively than any man with respect to so many gifts that they bring to ministry. So one response to women in ministry like them is this real embrace of them. The other day when I heard someone say of Mother Annie, she's our girl, it just really represented for me how it is that people really embrace this gospel vision, or as Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza suggested, this discipleship of equals, this vision that Paul of Tarsus and Jesus of Nazareth had of how it is that we might live in relationship to one another a bit differently. The other response is characterized by a young married couple who came to Mass the other week, and after it sank in that it was Mother Annie who was presiding at the liturgy, Well, by the time that we had finished the Gloria, they had decided that they were going to shake the dust of our community from their feet and
Mm,
walk out the door. And you can imagine that some people look at that and are a bit sad. And I thought to myself, my response to certain persons who expressed grief at that later was, well, good for them and good for us, because this is obviously not for everyone. And it's difficult knowing what and how to do with the various reactions and responses. I think my question for you and for Trish as well, especially as we start to wind down our time together, is how it is that all of us working together might help to lift up a different vision and really be prophetic, to cast this vision and this dream shared by Jesus of Nazareth and Paul of Tarsus and Martin Luther King Jr. and so many who've gone before us about the promised land that could await us.
mm, mm. Yeah, I think what I always come back to is that, prophets don't act in a vacuum. Prophets have community behind them. Martin Luther King was not a solo, crusader. He had a huge, huge group, a community behind him. A lot of whom were women, who were always at his side, always backing him up, welcoming them, taking care of him, giving him hospitality, giving him ideas, giving him strength, going to jail with him. It's really, really important that we remember that. I think we see prophets as solitary humans, exemplary humans, but there is no prophet without a robust support network of people who are willing to make the same sacrifices. It's just movements also need charismatic figurehead leaders, and he obviously was that. But it's so important to support your prophets, to be prophetic community. And that's how you live it out. And I think that's what you're doing now, in your respective communities, is you're showing the church, this is we're living in the future. We're living out the future. So when the time comes that you transform, you can see, how this is done. Um, and I think, and priesthood is so important. As much as I respect Elizabeth Schuster Fiorenza, her discipleship of equals, is still pretty anti-ordination. And I think that that's so unfortunate because, in my experience, we need priests. Priesthood is a very, very difficult job. It demands tremendous gifts and skills. And as we know, if you go to your ordinary parish, a lot of those skills are missing, right now. My poor mother, she's desperate to go to mass, but she goes and she's just like, oh my God, the homily, whatever, the politics, and so that's what I really want to say, is that we need this priesthood. It can't just be all volunteer. It's a vocation. It's a real job. It is one of the most demanding jobs in the world. It demands every fiber of your being. And we need the best of the best, and I think the beauty of these communities like you are leading or co-leading is that they are bringing forth, the people who really have the gifts and the skills to really nurture a community, that Catholics need. So I say just keep doing what you're doing, you know.
Yeah, I remember I was leading a national ministry project in the late 90s, and the data then, first of all, there were a record number of lay people in seminaries, a lot of more than half of them women.
Yeah.
And actually, American Catholic public opinion was very much, we can deal with that. We can deal with married men being priests. But it was the dissonance that we've been talking about in these other issues too, of, but the institution says it's impossible, and people not really being able to overcome that. I keep teasing, my community. I'm like, well, if there ever comes a day that the roof of the church opens up and I'm struck by lightning, then maybe God has weighed in. But for now, it sure looks like God's okay with me. I'm wondering though, like, as you look back and as you look forward, because you're still in the game, um, what has your activism cost you? And what has your activism given you? Like, if you look at your life, like you say, okay, we like to forget that, you mentioned the prophets. Well, they some of them didn't, we kill the prophets.
Yeah.
So, what do you
Yeah.
think when you look back and you think, well, what did you have to surrender, but what did you gain from being the
Yeah.
voice that you've been here in the United States?
I mean, I surrendered a proper career. I surrendered a 401k. I surrendered medical benefits, all of those things. The basic security because when I was first writing, people were loving what I was saying about the future of the church and young adults, and I was getting all of these invitations. And then about a week later, they'd be rescinded. And I realized it because they saw I was openly gay. And so I was losing all these opportunities, and so it's been, and that has been sort of the story of my career is I start to make progress and then, I take on this issue and it's like, oh, no, 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 she's naughty. We can't have her, it's too risky to have her speak. Or too risky to have her at the conference, too risky, and so I've sacrificed, a lot, in terms of my own well-being, financial well-being, my own building a career, being in places where my gifts were welcome and respected and encouraged. It's been really, really an ongoing challenge and a lonely one. So yeah, so I've given up a lot of those things, and then of course you lose community because people are with you until you take on that issue, and then you take that stand or you did that action, and that was beyond the pale, so that's been hard, but it has given me a lot of strength and resolve. There's this little thing I found at a flea market recently. It said, "The bridges I burn light my way." And I want the sticker and the magnet because I just needed that message at the moment. But there is a freedom in it, in that I don't have to worry. I'm free. There's no one that I live in fear of. I can say what I want to say. And I'm saying, and not what I want to say, but what I really do believe in my heart God wants me to say. It's a constant discernment, and as I say, I try to get out of it, and I say, let me become a cheesemaker, or, do something, and it's just like, but God finds a way to pull me back in, and so I'm giving another opportunity, and then I say something and people love what I said, and they're like, oh, we missed your voice, and okay, God, I'm back. So that's it. I think it has just given me tremendous freedom to live out the vocation that God is continually calling me to. And that's worth a lot.
Jayme, we've come to the point in our conversation where we typically think about some final words to be able to share with our listeners. So if you don't mind, I'll jump in first, then I'll invite Reverend Trish. And then after that, we'll have you close us out with some final words and thoughts. From my heart, I just want to let you know how beautiful it has been to share this time with you. Now in 2026, we're celebrating the 800th anniversary of the passing of St. Francis of Assisi, whom, according to texts in the 16th century, offered up those famous words, "Lord, make me an instrument." And when I hear your story, what I appreciate about it is how it is that you've allowed God to play God's music into our world through you, how you've allowed God to speak through you. Our English word prophet comes from a Greek word root prophenein, which means to speak through a mask. Thank you for being a mask through which God has been speaking to so many people in our world, through your writing, through your speaking, through your courage in being willing to stand up, especially from my perspective, to be able to stand with and for our sisters has really been a tremendous blessing in our world. So I would just want you to hear from me, the word on my heart is gratitude. Thank you for giving up those things that you could have otherwise enjoyed to really be a prophet. They crucified Jesus. They're going to crucify many more of us as well. And we'll continue taking arrows, but knowing that there are persons like yourself who've gone before us and have taken a good amount of arrows as well. And here we are. The Lord must have us here for a reason. Reverend Trish?
Well, I was thinking, Jayme, about I spent far more time as a lay leader in settings of faith communities than as an ordained one, and I really believe in the vocation of the laity, and I believe in the power of baptism. and that we all participate as priest, prophet, and ruler, king, queen, whatever. And I think you've been pastoring a lot of people for a long time, because one of the things that gives us strength is when we hear a voice that has some positional authority, some education, some whatever, say, no, there's another way you could consider that. And I think that's been part of your pastoring the church, from where your location is. And I'm really grateful for that. I also think, my academic work was in ecclesiology, and the church has always been embedded in culture. And one of the things that happened here in the United States, I think, is the culture moved really fast. And it's continuing to move. And the next generation is going to move it even more. So the culture will always be tugging at the church, and just the fact that Francis said, yeah, blessings are fine. That's the culture pulling along the Pope, and people being out in the culture and then going in front of him and saying, but we deeply love each other and we're committed. I have family members who had the most successful marriage on either side of my family, who finally, when the marriage amendment passed, were able to get married. But by all measures, they were really the most successful couple, right? So culture will pull us along, and theological voices, I hope, will help Catholics, see that there's another way to look at things. And I think you're one of those people. Some of us are called to step outside the fence, and some of us are called to stay inside it, but we're all tilling a quarter of the field that's got to be tilled, So as Jayme mentioned, you get the last word. What's your last word for us?
That's a beautiful metaphor about tilling the field. Geez. I think, just having, I don't see myself as in or out, with the church. And something interesting is happening to me right the last, I would say, year. I've been spending more time in Italy for various reasons, and I'm much more religious there. I go to church, and I'm not in Rome, and Rome is a whole other animal. I'm in another city that's much more progressive and has a really amazing cardinal who almost became pope. And but there is this sense of the tradition and the longevity of this church, and the generation of ancestors who have gone through these churches. The floors are so worn, and the pilgrimages they've taken. And I find myself connected, to the church in a very deeply religious way that I haven't been before. And I know that's part of whatever God is moving in me. And I'm even, I'm sitting and and before icons, and I'm praying, and these are things I haven't done in the US, and lighting candles, and it's very, very nurturing. And so I think that there's so many ways to be Catholic, and God moves us through different phases. But this is my way, even though, and some of my friends think, oh my God, they're not religious at all. And they're, my new friends in Italy, and, and I think I'm a bit of a weirdo, and, they can't make sense of it. They love me, but they can't make sense of it, And so I think that, just to embrace all the ways in which God is leading you, and to not be afraid. Even, for me, I'm like, am I going backward? What's happening to me? But just a profound openness to the way in which God is leading you, and a certainty in your heart that God is leading you, even in the hardest moments, in the most challenging moments. And we are in a very desperate, deep, challenging moment. Some of us personally, and certainly as a country. And so just to have, it's really, faith, even though, we have a wonderful tradition of doubt in Catholicism that I think we should all be really proud of. And that is a way in which that's an invitation to faith, and to be open to God leading us. And so that's why I could not have expected that for myself in this moment of my faith journey, but that's where I'm at, and it's connected me to whatever path God has for me that's ahead. So I don't know if that's helpful to the community, but that's where my heart is right now, what I feel called to share.
Jamie Manson, thank you for your time with us this evening. Jamie Manson, Henry Luce Fellow at the University of Colorado Boulder Center for Media, Religion, and Culture, and a longtime thought leader and advocate for women's equality, LGBTQ plus inclusion, and reproductive rights in the Catholic Church. So grateful for you. But also a big thank you to our listeners. Thank you for joining us for Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance. I'm Father Jayme Matthias.
And I'm Reverend Trish Sullivan-Bonney.
Let's continue to advocate.
Thank you for joining us for Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance. For more information on inclusive Catholicism, please visit extraordinarycatholics.faith. Keep the faith.